I want to first start off by saying big thank you to all the wonderful people who are supporting the Patreon for this podcast. They are getting some awesome bonus stuff like special recordings, sneak peeks of artwork and other projects that I'm working on, and they are helping grow this podcast. They are helping move towards the goal of providing transcriptions so that deaf people can take part in these conversations. And they are also helping support the work that I do, running down guests, getting people on the show, coordinating people in different time zones and on other sides of the planet. And finally, they're helping improve the production value of this podcast by allowing me to start considering acquiring better equipment and get away from some of the janky duct tape together process I've been doing for a long time. If you dig the podcast, jump over to patreon.com/thehermitslamp and pitch in. Every dollar helps. So welcome to another installment of the Hermit's Lamp podcast. I'm here today with Langston Kahn, and we are, I know Langston from the internet and from seeing a lot of really interesting images of masks and conversations about mask work. And that's kind of what piqued my interest. But I know that there's a lot more going on than that. So tell me, for those who don't know you, what's going on? What are you up to?
Yeah, hi. So I'm a shamanic practitioner primarily. So what that means is that I help people with things like soul retrieval, shadow retrieval, ancestral healing, essentially any wound of the soul or that's located in the spirit world that someone might have. I'm helping them to see what are the sort of relationship between those wounds and the challenges they're currently facing in their life. So often people are bringing to me like many different types of challenges that they're experiencing around stuck places in their life or areas of big transformation that's needed. Because usually when someone's coming to me, they've reached a point where they're so frustrated and they've tried a bunch of different practitioners that they're willing to let die the current self they are for the sake of the person they could be, the person who no longer has the challenges they're currently facing. And so that's usually at the intersection where I'm working, helping to sort of midwife and facilitate that transformation or even death to allow that new self to be born. And how that plays out in my own practice is that I'm, part of many different traditions and practices, but the tradition that is sort of what I call my heart tradition is the cycle teachings or the last mass community. And that's sort of this 5-year training program and also community that helps people just to sort of step into spiritual adulthood in a sense. And so for me, that was the first place that I really felt myself being having questions answered that I had had for a long time about wounds that I felt within myself. And it's not a training to be a shamanic practitioner, but during the course of just sort of following the path of my own healing, that it became clear to me that that was work that I was being called to do as well on behalf of other people.
Yeah, it's always, I find that intersection between being called to be a teacher or healer and our own healing so fascinating, and I think that I see lots of people doing it in lots of different ways, but I think it's always fascinating where people are beginning with their own healing and then emerging
and then being called to that next level of offerings. And also kind of the opposite, where, I see lots of people who go into something to become a teacher or healer or, something along those lines. And then through that, realize that they need their own healing. And sometimes even then, realize they don't need any of the rest of that,
Mm-hmm.
I find that fascinating how that journey can sort of shape and open up a road for us that isn't necessarily what we imagined it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when I set out on this path, one of my cohort members was actually reminding me, I said, well, one thing I know for sure is I never want to do this kind of work on behalf of other people. Because at that time, it just was so out of my vision for my life at that time and who I was. I was having a lot of emotional difficulties and physical difficulties. And what my main focus was a lot of the creative work in film that I was doing at that time. But as, again, like you were saying, as I followed the path of my own healing and really began to chase down the roots of some of these challenges I was facing in my life, I began to reclaim and rediscover parts of myself that really loved doing this type of work, and really started to remember how throughout my life, people had always come to me for this type of help in a sense. Though at the time I didn't really have those tools to share with them, so I just could be a good listener in a sense. And that felt very frustrating to me. I also had a lot of issues with, as I think many people do, with taking on others' emotion and martyring myself in that way. And so it took me a long time of really learning to have a new relationship with my own boundaries, to be able to engage with people with compassion without feeling the need to take on everything that they were experiencing, just being able to be present before that would even seem like a possibility to me, to be doing that type of work on behalf of other people, where you're getting so intimate on a soul level with their stuff, really literally stepping inside of it and navigating it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a friend of mine, when I first started working as a reader, this friend of mine, Sam, said to me, he's like, your first order of business is to go dig into anything that you've got left that's unresolved and get that stuff tidied up. Because otherwise you're just going to run into everybody else's pain and it's going to trigger yours. And then you're going to do what with it, right? Mm-hmm. How are you going to be able to channel that, to bring it through, to be clear with that, right? It's very difficult, right? But and it's really unglamorous too. Like that's the other thing I think about it. I think about when I started my sort of spiritual journey in ceremonial magic and stuff, right? Mm-hmm. I never anticipated that I would be digging into my own junk and, doing a couple of years of therapy and all that really unglamorous stuff that made me good at what I do today, but that just wasn't even foreseeable on the horizon when I started,
Yeah, and I think that intersection is really interesting. I think in Western culture, because we're sort of swimming in this ideology of separating out these different parts of ourselves so much, we don't really see the connections always. It's like, oh, there's my emotional work I do with my therapist, and there's my spiritual work I do my lodge or whatever, and then there's my physical work I do at the gym, and then there's my emotional work or something, or mental work. And I think the more, especially, we move along a path of connecting with the spirit world in some way, the more we start seeing or being shown those intersections, and how important it is to be actively evolving each of those, kind of in that alchemical principle of as within, so without, that, as you were saying, the more you're connecting to the spirit world, the more opportunity there is for distortions to come through you, or actually to do harm, if we're not also engaging these other parts of ourselves and keeping them balanced in that process, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like the world card, right? With those sort of 4 animals in the corners, each representing one part of us, right? That if they're all together, then they make this beautiful space in the middle where everything can be balanced and free and emerge. But if something's out of sync, then we're going to slide out of that space into something else, which maybe is not as joyful or pleasant or functional, Yeah. So I'm curious. You mentioned practicing multiple traditions. How do you juggle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it for me that's been really helpful is note, and of course this shifts all the time, but
Yeah.
noticing what each tradition's sort of unique genius or gifts are in relationship to my life. In a sense of, I'm someone who, even though I practice many traditions, I'm not trying to sort of combine them all into one Uber tradition or one, Uber paradigm. I'm keeping them very separate and practicing them as I've been taught them in their respective traditions. But my shamanic practice, because it's so much working at the essence of things and in a sense almost like at the source code level, it feels like organically sometimes spirits or cosmologies from other traditions come into that work a bit, and that's kind of like my hub where I can connect in with all those other traditions. But at the same time, I'm not sort of mixing practices. Like I'm not just deciding, oh, I have the right to say I'm an initiated priest in this tradition because I have this level of intimacy with spirit in this other tradition. So for me, it helps to have sort of physical, ordinary reality things that I'm connecting each tradition to. So for example, maybe, I'm involved in Orisha tradition. So let's say with my warriors, I'm focusing on one thing right now in my life. And then I'm also involved in Kimbanda, which is an Afro-Brazilian tradition. And so in that tradition, I'm focusing on something else maybe currently in my life with those particular spirits. And I find that helps me avoid getting lost in sort of the sea of voices that are out there in these traditions. And also, when something actually happens in relationship to that work I'm doing with those spirits, I know what spirit is actually helping me or guiding me in that work. And I'm not thinking, oh, maybe it was this or maybe it was that, and just like getting sloppy in a sense with who I'm giving offerings to or who I'm thanking for this work. That's sort of how I keep sane in a sense.
It's interesting. It's fascinating for me personally because I don't practice multiple traditions. I only practice, the one tradition, the Orisha tradition. And so, I'm always curious about how that balance works for people, because I find personally that, I only have so much attention and energy. And, I find that, it's really just a personality difference or a circumstance difference maybe, but I find myself unable to sustain very many different things, and it's funny because I look back historically and it's like when I learned tarot, I just got into Aleister Crowley's Thoth deck, and then I read with that deck for like 15 years. And it never even occurred to me to get another deck, I knew they were out there, but they just didn't exist in my world. There was the deck and there was the book he wrote, and that was the end of the conversation for so long, So yeah, I'm always really interested about how that works. And I can see how, especially if you're focused on a dialogue around a particular thing or a particular area or topic, that could really help build that connection and really keep it nice and clean. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it helps shrines avoid getting dusty in a sense too. Like if you have this concrete thing that's important to you in your life that you're working on with these particular spirits in your life, not to make it a utilitarian relationship. Like obviously it's really intimacy and growth, and there's a lot of mystery there, but grounding that relationship in a specific aspect of my life I'm working on helps me to notice when that relationship is falling by the wayside, because probably that thing in my life is also falling by the wayside.
Yeah, it makes a practice that you can tend and work at, right? As opposed to just being like, yeah, I got all those people, they're in the cupboard, it's good,
Yeah,
it's
totally.
like, maybe not so much, right?
Or only going to them when some disaster is happening or something, yeah.
Oh yeah, there's always that for sure. So I'm also really, you mentioned earlier something along the lines of people come to you when they're ready to let their old self die, right? Um, Tell me about that. What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, I guess I said that in a very dramatic way, but
Yeah, it's lovely. I dig
yeah,
it.
totally. What I think that looks like is a person, usually, not always. I have some clients that come to me when they're, things are going fairly well, but they just need more information about something, or we need to make a shift in some way. But the majority of people I say who come to me, they're in a lot of emotional distress, or physical distress, or mental distress in their life. There's some big thing that feels completely immovable to them that they're knocking their heads up against. And so a lot of my job in that situation is looking at what is the true root of that challenge that they're experiencing currently through the eyes of my helping spirits in the spirit world. Now, sometimes that might be soul loss. So what soul loss is, in sort of a contemporary shamanic context, but also across many indigenous traditions, is this sense of a part of yourself that leaves, either due to you abandoning it or it choosing to leave because your life just felt too painful for it to continue to exist in it. Or there can also be, in the case of sorcery, someone taking that part of you, whether unconscious sorcery or conscious sorcery. Now, when I retrieve that part of the person, I'm tracking that challenge, the energy of that challenge they're currently facing, to where that part of them left. And I have to find out through tracking the energy what age that part of them is, what sort of emotional or psycho-spiritual landscape it's in, and describe that to the person. And then I have to give that part of them whatever energy it's needing to feel safe enough to be able to come back into their life. So when they finally come back, the person has already spent maybe much of their life with this hole within them that they've developed a lot of skillful survival mechanisms to avoid touching into, like coping mechanisms in a sense.
Sure.
So when that part of you comes back, it feels really uncomfortable at first often. Sometimes it just feels like a relief because maybe the person's done a lot of emotional work to change those survival mechanisms, but often they bring back some of the emotions of their past, and they also are bumping up against all of those mechanisms you developed to avoid engaging with that part of you. So the person has to begin engaging with that soul part in the integration process to ask it, what do I need to start doing or stop doing for it to fully integrate with me? And in taking those actions and in pushing into those uncomfortable emotions, that's where the true transformation occurs. There's usually some influx of energy right after the session as well, but for many people, like the actual shift, like what I was talking about, that death, happens as they're integrating that part of themselves back, because eventually there's no longer a part to talk to. The part is them, or it's come back into them, and they're a new person. The person, because retrieving that one part changes your whole self. It's not like just a puzzle piece that you put back, in a sense.
Yeah. And that's definitely what I hear. I've definitely heard people talk about it like it's a puzzle piece, right? Yeah, I was having some problems in my marriage, and then I did a soul retrieval, and now everything's good. And it's like, wow, that's some mighty magic. Wow, what does that mean? How did that happen? How is that in action, right?
Yeah.
But I think that's a part of, really every spiritual tradition that people don't really talk about much, right? So you do the work and you get initiated, or you do a soul retrieval, or you go out in the woods and do your wandering and talk with something and come back. But then there's that act of integration, right? And there's that act of living with that transformation. And I think that's such an under communicated about piece of this equation, right? Because without that work, it's kind of like my shoulder that I dislocated, right? They put it back in place, it's fine, right? But if I do certain things, it'll start to slide out of place again now. Like it's never, the history of it requires attention and work to keep it in that good relationship. And not to say that these things require all that kind of ongoing work, but it's not as easy as, we just put it back and everything's good now, right?
Yeah. And so part of the work I also do is on the more emotional level, which is separate from my shamanic healing work, around helping people to sort of use triggers or stuck places, things that are making them amp up or shut down in their life or feel much younger than they are, to track those back to the root in their body where they made a decision, maybe as a child or just younger, to survive in that moment, which is slightly different than a moment of soul loss, which is really more extreme level of that completely detaching in space and time from you. But there's also plenty of times when we just make decisions to survive because we think we're not going to be loved if we don't make those decisions, or we're going to be abandoned or isolated or hurt in some way. But that part of us gets stuck continuing to make that same decision again and again. Mm-hmm. So then we have to, through these sort of emotional techniques, show up for that part of ourself that made that decision in a way that the adults or the teachers or the authority figures in their life couldn't show up for them at that time. And so I find it's really interesting to see how that type of work intersects the soul retrieval and the integration process. Because often when the soul part comes back with those emotions from the past, now I'm having to guide the client in becoming that compassionate adult they didn't have at that time that can welcome that part of themselves home and give them the space and grounding they need to feel safe to be a kid and feel those feelings without feeling like if they feel them, they'll be abandoned again in some way.
Yeah. Feelings can be some intense business, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's like, and working to be able to experience and own a full spectrum of feelings as a human being is also not really that easy, right? I mean, there's so much, all of these kinds of challenges, you know, whether the traumatic and soul loss ones or the sort of smaller scale, you know, more ongoing kind of processes, you know, it's really easy to start to shut stuff down and disassociate or build scripts that, you know, allow us to adapt to them, right? You know, and so when people come to you, are they looking for healing? Are they looking for to achieve something? What's the motivation? What kind of thing do you see? Because like you, people often only come to me when things have gotten bad, right? They're like, you know what? I literally almost can't get out of bed in the morning. Can I get a reading? And I'm like, sure, you know, but you know, but where are people at when they're coming to you? What do you see with that?
There's different things people want. I think the common thread is some kind of transformation needs to occur, that they're not always cognizant of that in the moment. They might just know I'm in pain, you know, and I need to make this pain stop. That's usually a common thread. Or there might be a sense of, I've just been trying to shift this for so long and it feels like nothing I do works. So I need some other perspective or guidance in that. Those are usually the two main places people are coming from. I've had people come with chronic pain issues. I've had people come with just after really intense breakups and they're just feeling like everything has come into question. I've had people come with just really terrifying spiritual experience they don't know how to explain, that they're needing to bring into context and sort of mend or heal their relationship with the spirit world in a sense. Money can be a common thing, you know, just struggle with finances and stuff. I think that's in anyone in the spiritual community finds that. People coming to them with that problem. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the other things that you brought up, which I super dig because it's really a place where I do a lot of work myself with people, is like around ancestral healing, you know? And so, you know, I think it's, I mean, one of the things that I do a lot of work with is noticing people's, you know, the ancestral legacy that has continued on to this person, right? And working with that to sort of disrupt the ways in which the person is now carrying that legacy forward so that they, you know, they can mend that and find their way forward. But what kind of stuff are you doing with people around that?
Well, oftentimes when I'm doing ancestral healing with someone, it's because an ancestral pattern has showed up in the course of a shamanic healing session. So when I'm going into a session, I'm not assuming I know what I'm not assuming I know someone is experiencing soul loss. It might be soul loss, might be ancestral stuff, it might be shadow stuff, it might be like a depossession needed. I'm just going in and trusting that my helping spirits will guide me what's needed. So sometimes where I'm pointed to is the ancestral realms. And a few clues I have that might be the case is often if someone's experiencing something that almost feels like possession, like they have a belief or an action they're taking they know isn't quite true and know isn't the right action, but they just can't quite seem to stop making it. Like even as they're doing it, they know it's not the right thing to do, but they still do it anyway. Or there's this sense of just overwhelmed with a pattern. They've done all of this good emotional work, therapeutic work, magical work to change. And yet it's still just, they like climb out from under it and then just overtakes them back like a wave, almost like clockwork again and again. Often those are signs that there's some kind of ancestral component involved. Because in my way of seeing things, when that's the case, when there's an ancestral component, no matter how much work we do on ourselves, if we haven't resolved the problem at the root in the ancestral realms where it's located, and that's still going to keep showing up in some way. Because the sort of the dead or the unresolved dead try to resolve their lives through their descendants, in a sense. They don't have free will anymore because they don't have a body any longer. And so they're trying to resolve the mistakes they made or the resentments or anger or sadnesses, regrets that they had in their life through their descendants. But they don't know how to do that because they're just still stuck with the same patterns they set up during their life. So it's just,
all they can do is reenact some version of what they already did.
Exactly.
Yeah,
they're just swimming. It's aware swimming in that as their descendants, all those mistakes and old beliefs that aren't true, that aren't based in reality. And so because our ancestral stuff is at the blood level and we're swimming in it since we're born, often those things just feel like, like you wake up and you go to work and you go home and the sun sets and the sun, rises and there's never enough money. That's just part of like reality, like the sun setting and rising, never enough money.
Yeah.
Or like, I have to sacrifice myself to be loved. Like, just there's these beliefs or stories that we just feel like are just how the world works. We just take for granted. And those are often the ones that are rooted in our ancestral patterns. And then we can see them if we look going down our father's line or our mother's line. And so how I do that work often is I'm using a construct that allows me to move into the ancestral realms and go track back to the earliest time that pattern got set up. Because oftentimes it's not just one ancestor that's holding this pattern. It's sort of like started with one, but then it snowballed down the lines and got worse and worse and worse with each generation. And you can see that as you're looking back at your family history, if you're lucky enough to have a knowledge of some of those stories and understanding of your family. And so I'm going to the earliest place that pattern started and working with that ancestor to clean up their mess, essentially. And then I'm outlining what those patterns are that got set up in that life. And I should say, often it's not like some big crazy curse or some like horrible thing. Sometimes it's horrible things, but oftentimes it's just a mistake someone made that resulted in, in a moment of tiredness or just fear that someone made a bad decision and it resulted in this horrible thing and they died and it didn't get resolved and then it just kept getting worse and worse throughout the generations.
Well, you don't have to, like, if you think you go back, like, say you go back like the previous 4 generations, right? I mean, how many horrible things have happened in the world during that time, right? Like
totally
famines and depressions and wars and all sorts of horrible violent acts and genocides and all sorts of, astounding things. And, I find that like when we're doing ancestral work, it's not about, like you say, some like curse or, like it's rarely like, well, 25 generations ago, blah, blah. It's like, no, like there are these people and they died in this way or they lived through this horrible experience. And that's continued to then shake down, snowball, roll through those generations, I mean, how much violence and abuse and alcoholism and all sorts of other things just have been lingering in our world in the last century or so.
Absolutely.
It's a tremendous amount, you know? And it's not to say that there was some golden era before that either, because I have no idea and I wouldn't say so. But we don't have to look back that far unless, as you say, that line continues further and further. So,
and I think one of the, again, I don't want to idealize Indigenous communities, but I think there is a way in which that you can see how bad it's gotten in contemporary Western culture compared to some earlier Indigenous communities, in that when you look at the spiritual technologies of those communities, a lot of them don't have tools actually for doing this kind of level of deep ancestral healing of patterns that have gone on for generations. It's more, they have a lot of really precise and powerful tools for addressing issues of the recently dead, or maybe 1 or 2 generations back. But because there is a understanding of responsibility for our dead and tending that line, and certain people in the family step up to take that responsibility of keeping that line healthy and whole and tended, and certain people in the community do that as well. And I feel we're seeing the fallout from what happens when you stop doing that or considering those practices, in a sense.
For sure, yeah. Nobody's taking care of these spirits in the same way. Nobody's doing healings or extended rites for them that sort of facilitate this stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like, well, we go, we say some prayers, we put them in the ground or put them in a vase, and then we're done with it, right? Like, that's the end. We're good. Now we can get on with our life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like there's a way in which funerary practices have become much more about the living than whereas you look in Indigenous communities, like, say, for example, the Dagara culture of Burkina Faso, where they have these beautiful grief ceremonies where people are, crying and wailing and really allowing that grief to be moved so that the dead can move on and not hold all these attachments. And also people are like gathering together, and they're not just saying, don't speak ill of the dead. There's whole rituals around saying, hey, this person messed up and they may be angry. And so I wish that could be remediated. I don't know if they can be now. Maybe someone in the village company, maybe they can't. And this is a really good thing that person did. And just like hashing it out in a way that helps facilitate that person's process of really moving on and reconciling their life and getting to where they're needing to go, rather than just focusing on the living.
Yeah, and it's one of when I teach mediumship type work to people, it's one of the first things that we start with is just because they're dead doesn't mean that they've changed at all. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe they have, maybe they've evolved, maybe they got a perspective, but maybe they just carried that stuff over to the other side and now they're going to continue it from there. Right? There's no clear guarantee in that kind of way.
Absolutely.
So when you're talking about working with the land of the dead and stuff, are you talking about like traveling in your spirit there? Or are you talking about like a meditative interface? Like, what does that look like in practice for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I'm doing journey work, what I'm doing is when I have a client over, I'm beating a drum and I have a blindfold on and we're both lying down and I'm speaking aloud after a moment of like some certain songs I have to sing and certain offerings I need to make and tending my shrines in a certain way. Then I'm going into this deep trance state where I am narrating out loud what's happening as I'm navigating the spirit world. So when I'm going into the ancestral realms, I'm in that trance state in my spirit, traveling into this sort of cosmology hub that I have where I do a lot of my work. And then I'm moving into a construct that I've created with my helping spirits in the tradition that I'm part of that's allows me to interface in a safe way with sort of the ancestral realm, specifically the unresolved ancestors that are haven't quite made it to truly the ancestral realms. So another thing that I have to do before I do that is I have a special mask that I've made, which my spirits have told me certain things to do with it that make me kind of look like a dead person. So I'm not swarmed while I'm there by all these sort of restless or unresolved dead people. And I'm free to just be tracking with some of my ancestor helping spirits, those energies down their lines. Yeah. And then what I'm doing is once I track the problem, then I'm sort of moving into the life that person lived. So I wouldn't say I'm going actually into the ancestral realms at that time. That's kind of like a misspeaking. It's more that I'm moving into the area of this construct I've created that sort of gathers up the person's unresolved dead, and then
Right.
using that to interface with that unresolved dead person's life and engage with them there where this unresolved energy first happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do you find, like I always find it very interesting, sort of all these possible distinctions between elements of the dead, and is it this, are you, forgive me if the terms don't make sense to you, but please just correct me, but like, are you interfacing with like what people might call like their Akashic record of this person, like that sort of universal store of that information? Are you interfacing with the actual spirit of a person who's an ancestor who's dead? Are you in the energy of this person that you're working with, and where that residual is of that thing for them? Like what kinds of things are we talking about, if it's possible to draw any of those distinctions, or if they don't make sense, then let me know. But
yeah, well, all this stuff starts to break down a little bit when you try to put it into language in that way, I feel like. But I wouldn't say it's the Akashic records. To me, that has, I've done some work with what you might call the Akashic records, but it's very much a sort of immortal soul level record to me. It's like this tracking of souls as they move through reincarnations, in a sense, is one way of looking at it. Actually, I'm not sure if that's like the most correct way, but that's the way I see it. And whereas ancestors to me are the sum total of a person's life actions that they've taken. When we look at it in Congo cosmology, and you're looking at like the Kalunga, it's like there's this whole sea of the dead. And when you're calling on a specific ancestor and saying their name and telling their stories, it's like you're animating a wave out of that sea of the dead with that person's mask. And then you can draw upon them for wisdom and guidance and strength. But in a sense, as you're healing your ancestral lines and engage with your ancestors, you're learning to engage more and more skillfully with that sea of the dead, in a sense, that chorus of voices that are the ancestors. And so with these people that are unresolved that I'm working with, I don't technically put them in the ancestor category because they haven't fully moved on from the realm of the living. They're kind of stuck here, in a sense, by their unresolved issues, and they haven't, like, in a sense, again, it gets hard to talk about this across cosmologies because every cosmology is very different. But in a broad sense, what I see is supposed to happen is these ancestors are meant to go to a place where they can reconcile their life after they die. Then they're meant to go make the journey to the ancestral realms, probably supported with lots of offerings and prayers and help getting there. So they have food and water along the way. And then once they make it there, there's this sense of sort of unifying with, for lack of a better word, like source, or that sense of oneness and connection to spirit in that very pure form. And then they become someone who carries both the understanding of what it was to be a human incarnate on earth and what it is to be pure spirit. So they have that unique bridging wisdom. And then they can choose, if we call them back and ancestralize them, to come back as true ancestor helping spirits that can guide us and support us. But if they haven't made that journey yet, if they're just stuck here mired in their, shit, for lack of a better word, then they are, to me, not yet true ancestors. And so when I'm in this realm that's this construct, it's more, like you said, I'm tracking sort of where the person's energy intersects with their lineage and the bloodlines that are flowing through them. And I'm sort of gathering up their unresolved dead in this construct and using that construct to track a specific pattern down a line to see where it originates.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that I'm always curious about these questions because they're tremendously difficult to answer. And thank you for your wonderful conversation on it. Like, I think that it really is truly difficult to speak clearly and definitely to speak universally about these things. And I think that it's really clear to also, or it's really helpful to be clear about what is and what isn't going on, right? Like, it's very different to like call up Uncle Bill, and actually have Uncle Bill as a discrete, separate entity with their complete own consciousness show up, versus have some interface of Uncle Bill and our energy and their whatever spirit is around, and like all that kind of stuff that's amalgamated in ways that that can feel very much like there's a spirit there, or can reenact that kind of performance, but isn't necessarily actually a separate being in and of itself. So yeah, I think that's really, really interesting, which kind of brings me to one of the other things, which I think that causes sometimes this kind of, I don't know what the right word for it is, over-interpretation or over-identification with fragmentary pieces of lineage and ancestral stuff, which is where that shadow stuff feeds into that, right? Because I've definitely have seen many times where that kind of a person's shadow, instead of drawing from the world of the ancestors to feed that energy, actually comes out of their own shadow self in a way, and animates that piece or that structure in a way that gives a very different kind of thing and causes all sorts of problems. So I'm curious about, your work with shadows, obviously, because like it's one of the big things that motivated me to be like, get you on the show. But also, where you see that in ancestral stuff kind of overlapping, if there's something with that too.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I love what you said about that, the shadows animating the dead, because it's actually like almost the exact same words I've used myself to describe that experience. In our community, actually, our shamanic community, there was a time when many people in the community were not quite bringing to completion their shadow work before they got to year 4 when we start doing a lot of the ancestor work. And so when they got to this construct that we use to engage with the unresolved ancestors, just like you said, their shadows were animating those ancestors. So it was terrifying to be around those unresolved dead people, because our shadow has so much fear and self-sabotage and anger wrapped up in it. But so I love that description you gave, but just to go back a bit and say how I view what shadow is, because it's a big word that a lot of people have definitions of. I see shadow as the parts of ourselves that they're perfectly good, authentic, beautiful parts of ourselves that we have disowned and buried in our unconsciousness because our mind decided, if I embody this part of me, I will die. And again, for a child, I will die can mean because you're not going to be loved. If they don't love me, they won't feed me tomorrow, because you're going to be abandoned, because you'll be isolated, because you'll be banished. All of these things are made to feel sometimes by authority figures, or parents, or teachers, or just our culture, or ancestral patterns. Another way ancestral patterns interact. If you have like an ancestral belief that tells you it's, if you speak up, you're going to be squashed, then of course that part of you, this brilliant, beautiful speaker, is going to feel like it has to be shoved into the shadow by your mind.
Yeah. And it's amazing what feels like life and death when you're like 2 and 3 and 5. I mean, and 25 and 50 and 100 too, but like, especially when you're small, things can feel so dire.
And it's true, for a small person, because they're dependent on their parents. So it's not like it's a false belief. It's just, unfortunately, that part of us that makes that decision to survive out of fear gets stuck, and no like helping spirit can come in and undo that decision for us, because we made it ourselves with our free will. So meanwhile, this part of ourself is then stuck in the shadow, and it's becoming just like it would if like you took a child and shoved it in a basement, and there were like children playing upstairs every day, and got to look at them outside the window occasionally through a peephole. It would become jealous and twisted and distorted over time. So because these parts of ourselves are forced to watch our life from the sidelines. So they manifest only often in these patterns of self-sabotage or intense attraction to people that we think will see that part of ourselves or bring that part of ourselves out without us consciously realizing that's why we're attracted. And often just in, again, a feeling of possession, but that's slightly different than the ancestral feeling of possession. It's more like total unconsciousness. Like you don't realize what you just did, but everyone in your life, all your best friends are like, dude, that wasn't okay. That was really terrible. It's like, what do you mean? I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. You know, like, I don't understand why that was weird. And it's,
there's a reflexiveness
like
to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's just, you know, you run into a certain stimulus that stimulates that shadow piece, you know, whether it's through desire or fear or whatever. And then there's just this reactive piece that happens. And you don't even notice it necessarily because it's there to help you not notice in those situations, right?
Exactly. Yeah, just take you right offline. Yeah. So in the work I do with shadow, it's a lot about finding that part of yourself. And I would say that, you know, in my experience with shadow work, I don't think people can often do this work skillfully on their own, that you really need either a practitioner or a community. Like the way I first did this work was, again, in my shamanic community of the cycle teachings, the last mass community. And we have a whole year that we spend focusing on pulling out sort of 4 kind of archetypal types of shadows that everyone has. And of course, how those show up is different for everyone, but there's sort of 4 main categories. And then what we do is we create a mask to give a home to that shadow part, so it no longer has to live in the shadow. And then so we're working with certain helping spirits that are very good at helping us navigate the shadow realm, so you can get totally lost in there, and you know, because your mind is literally taken offline again and again. And then once we successfully retrieve it and put it in a mask, then we're dancing that mask, allowing that shadow to move us and animate us, so through our body we can come to know that shadow and develop a new relationship with that energy. And then after the dance is over, put it back in the mask and put it away, maybe feed it occasionally. But I don't know if you ever saw the Babadook, but I felt like that movie was a great illustration of shadow process in a way. It's like this monster, in a sense, that you're needing to get to know and really see and form a new relationship with and feed. So over time, through your love and attention and care, it transforms from its enemy form into an ally form. And then you can begin to, just like with a soul part, move that ally into your life and see where it was meant to be going.
Yeah.
But you don't want to do that right away. You don't want to jump to like, oh, great, I got the shot and I want to integrate it, because it's still twisted and distorted.
Yeah. And maybe it still has that switch that gets your brain offline real fast, right?
Yeah.
Really, come on. Where did that day go? I don't know what happened. You know? How did I watch 22 hours of Netflix?
Yeah. And sometimes what I've seen with people in this type of process too is they get maybe over ambitious with integrating the shadow part. And so they haven't done the work yet to cultivate a life in which it would be safe for them to embody that part of themselves. And so in that case, then the part goes right back into the shadow. Like you said, the switch gets flipped and then it starts coming out maybe even more distorted ways. So it's a lot about this care of work with our helping spirits and the mask and dance to slowly over the course of that year transform these parts, rather than trying to just like integrate them all at once.
Yeah. I think that's I mean, I certainly know in various points in my life, I've been in a hurry to finish these pieces, right? You know, because they're not fun, right? They're not ideal. And, you know, like I spent a couple of years working with a Jungian analyst, and we did a lot of really great stuff, you know, along these lines through dreams and other things. And, you know, looking back, I could see what a tremendous gift it was. Looking at it, sort of trying to revision going through it. Some of it was just heart-wrenching and difficult, you know, and not comfortable. And, you know, there's nothing like, especially because we were doing a lot of dream work, to like wake up from these nightmares where my shadows are arising and showing themselves to me. And you just wake up with your heart pounding and you're sweating and you're just like, I can't look at that. That's not me. You know, it's so complicated, right? But I think that it really does behoove everybody to to take that time and really allow that to unfold, because there is no rushing it, right?
Mm-mm. Yeah, absolutely not. And that's funny. I actually, you mentioned dreams. That's one area where sometimes I see a lot of the different traditions that I'm part of intersect. Like all the spirits decide to show up for the dreams.
They're all just leaning against the wall, pointing at something. Hey, how about you do that now, dude? How about that?
Yeah. So I'd actually at one point I've been going through a shadow process that had a lot to do with anger that I had locked down and locked away, and learning to allow that to come into my life in a healthy way. But as I began to continue to engage with other processes, I kind of forgot about that thread, as we sometimes do in our transformational work, and was focusing on other things. And so then I was told, actually, with my Tata in Kimbanda, he was telling me that there would be a series of dreams that were sent to me by one of the spirits of that tradition. And as I began to receive those dreams, I forgot about that too. At the time, I just had a lot going on in my life. And what was happening is I'd have these dreams where I was battling this person that was like chasing me, and I'd be fighting them and like kicking them. And then finally I killed them in one of the dreams. And then I hid the body. And then later I was at one of my shamanic retreats, and I had a dream where one of my spirits from that tradition in Kibanda was there, and I was in a room with him, and he was sort of very seductive, and I realized that the police were coming to the house, and they were coming for him, but they were going to find me because I had buried this body. And it was like one of those weird continuous dreams. I remembered burying that body, but only in the dream space that I remember that this happened. And so I woke up out of the dream, and what I ended up having to do after some guidance from my teacher about that dream was go dig up that body. And it was this very much similar to the shadow process I've been doing. I had to go into the woods, and where I had buried this body in journey, entering back into my dreamscape. And what I found there was that what I had buried was my anger. That I hadn't, like I was saying, I hadn't quite cultivated in my life the boundaries or practices I needed to be safe in being with that part of me yet. And so now that I had, after some other process, and it was time for me to dig that part up, and my, Kimbanda spirits were very happy to step forward to help me to remember that part of me, because they're very fiery, hot spirits that have a lot to do with these emotions of like anger and lust and creativity. So they're right on there. So it's just one interesting example of how this work can intersect, and how dream can be a great crossroads where a lot of these elements come together for me.
Yeah. Well, and it also highlights how valuable having community or teachers or people you're checking in with are too, right? Because it's so easy to forget something. I was journaling and reading cards for myself today, and something that I had decided on and done some work on like back in April resurfaced, and I was like, oh yeah, I forgot to finish that, And it's like, teachers and community can facilitate that in a way that it's easy. It can be easier to not misplace those notions for as long, But like you say in the dream, body still needs to be dealt with. It's not really going anywhere. There's no avoiding it, right?
Yeah. And what my teacher said to me at the time, actually, which was really valuable, was you need to go find that body, and you need to determine, does this need to be buried in a way that it'll never be found, or does this need to be brought back? And so it needed to be reclaimed and brought back. But I like that you left that option too for me.
It's easier when there's a choice sometimes, right?
Yeah.
This thing that I don't want to do, you could deal with it in this way or that way, and then you get to like, oh yeah, I got to deal with it in this way. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, totally.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a great point about how important community is, because community is certainly like a theme in my life that's incredibly important. But especially with shadow work, you are in a place when shadow patterns are coming up where everything you know to be true is probably wrong. Or you're doing these things that are completely in your unconscious, so you cannot see how the patterns you're doing are harmful. Everything
you think you're being
yeah.
super rational, and
exactly.
all you're doing is rationalizing, right?
And so if you don't have community that you've cultivated this level of love and trust with, it, you can trust them more than you trust even your own sense of truth. It's really hard to transform shadow patterns, because you need someone who can hold that mirror up for you in a way that you can trust them.
Yeah. And then, further to kind of what you said earlier, and then you got to start doing a bunch of work on it.
Yes. Right? Yeah.
Like that's like, oh yeah, there's my homework for the next 3 to 6 months. All right. I will now work on that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not just about knowing it and seeing it. Definitely.
For sure. I think that there's this sort of tendency that it's so human, right? To like, we hit the aha moment and we're like, oh yeah, I get it. And then we think we're done, right?
Yeah. Now I can make brand new choices because my mind understands this.
Exactly. I'm liberated by the power of my consciousness. It's like, goodness, if you are that person, I don't want to hear about it because I'm so jealous. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Bless your heart if you're that person. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for making time today to have this conversation. It's been really, really fascinating to jump through these different pieces and stuff. Where can people find you? And I understand you have a thing coming up, so maybe you want to mention that too for people who are interested in some more of this kind of goodness.
Yeah, thanks. People can find me at occupy-your-heart.com. And there are listed my one-on-one shamanic healing work, and also classes that I offer. So the next class that's coming up in February, actually it's February 10th, is a 5-week class in emotional clearing. And I find that the emotional clearing work is a really excellent foundation for kind of all of the work we've been talking about today, in terms of helping people to begin to really engage with their life as a teacher and integrate the wisdom of their body and their mind and their spirit and their heart as they track triggers or stuck places in their life to the place where they first started, where that pattern first got set up, and then begin to shift and change and transform them there using the wisdom of the body as their guidance.
Amazing. It sounds really good. And from people I know who've done work with you, I hear great things. So if you feel called, go check it out for sure. Well, thanks again, Langston. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's been wonderful talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you, as always, for listening. I hope you've really enjoyed it. A big thanks to the lovely human beings who have put some wonderful reviews on iTunes for the podcast. Please do consider supporting the Patreon. I sound like a PBS ad, but seriously, even $1 helps. It all adds up towards being able to make all sorts of exciting things happen, both for yourself and for others. So head on over to patreon.com/thehermitslamp or use the link in the show notes. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.